Coming up, we peer into the future of the Alaska Permanent Fund Dividend Program.
It won't stay around forever. I think it's not something that's sustainable.
The legislature at a historical crossroads.
You've got to protect it in the Constitution.
Why these middle school students are not optimistic.
I'm not sure if we'll always get it.
Ahead, different ideas on what to do to protect your dividend.
Alaska, where there are old triumphs, but also new frontiers, with challenges as great as the state itself, but a belief that the best is yet to come, bringing you the faces, the places, and the spirit of the last frontier. This is Frontiers with Rhonda McBride.
Welcome to Frontiers. When the state legislature created the Alaska Permanent Fund more than 40 years ago, it was uncharted territory. Back then, Alaskans had no idea what to expect. Yet since the fund was created, it's paid out more than $22 million in dividends and has grown to about $65 billion. But with multi-billion-dollar state deficits and a need to tap the earnings to pay for government, how long will the fund continue to grow? Well, that's a question we put to students who grew up with a dividend. We asked them to tell us what they see when they peer into the future.
What do I think the future of it is? It will probably go away, and that'll be unfortunate.
How many years have you had it?
I am 24 years old, so that many years.
During that time, the dividend was a big help to Kyle Palatier's family.
It was money that my mom could put towards our family, put towards the house, towards food, towards meals. It was extremely helpful in regards to that. And at this point, now that I'm out of the house, it helps me pay tuition for college.
Like Kyle, many of the students here at the University of Alaska Anchorage have never known what it was like to not have a dividend. But the political pendulum has begun to swing the other way now that the fund's earnings will soon be tapped to cover the state's massive deficits. The question is, how far will it swing? Tell me what you see for the future.
I think it's going to dwindle down to nothing with all the legislation and taxes.
Do you think your kids will get a PFD?
I mean, we'll see. I mean, I don't know. I don't know.
You don't think your kids will get a check?
Probably not, with how our government wants to take it and use it for other funds.
Such as education. The university's budget has lost a lot of ground in recent years, and some say the dividend is a luxury the state can no longer afford.
I think it's expendable.
Why?
Why? Well, there's many other sources that fund could go to besides just putting it back into the pockets of Alaskan.
Soon, a new generation of students will walk through these doors. You have to admire Phil Walters' patience with his drumline class. Just as there is in Juneau, there's a lot of sound and fury to channel.
All right, let's do it. Let's see what we got.
It's a challenge to get the kids to pay attention to what's actually on the page.
We're trying to put a rest there, okay? And there's not one there.
But somehow, Mr. Walters gets them back on track.
Okay, not bad, not bad.
Not bad either about answering questions about the permanent fund dividend.
I think it has a future, but I think it's kind of not crystal clear exactly.
I'm not sure if we'll always get it, but I know that it's a help to the people.
A lot of families I know depend on the dividend to be able to pay for their bills or get groceries or stuff like that.
We put it into savings or to pay bills. Usually mine will go into college and stuff like that.
Every time we get a dividend, people spend more money. And when people spend money, it goes into the economy, and that really helps the economy of Alaska.
There's been a steady drumbeat of predictions in the news about the dividend's demise and talk from parents. So it's easy to understand why these students think the dividend will end with them.
All right, whoa.
I think that eventually the dividend will just keep going down and eventually it just won't be there anymore.
predictions on the death of the dividend, but every kid here hopes they're wrong.
It looks cloudy, but I mean, it can always change.
One of the Bagage Middle School students told us that he gave his dividend to his brother last year so that he could travel to check out a college he hoped to attend. Now, one study confirms what the students seem to intuitively know. It looked at the 2015 PFD, which was $2,015, and it reduced poverty in Alaska by more than 3%. Also, over a 15-year period, the study found that dividends lifted 15,000 to 25,000 Alaskans out of poverty. Up next, the dividend roller coaster.
It does cause all kinds of problems for the fund if you don't have a formula.
For 3 years, the formula for doling out dividends went by the wayside. What that means to your pocketbook. For Alaskans, the permanent fund and its earnings have been like a golden goose fed and cared for by a corporation whose mission is to keep the nest eggs coming. Through sound investments, the dividend has been doled out based on a 5-year average of the fund's performance to insulate the dividend from ups and downs of the stock market. And in the last few years, the stock market has done very well. Let's take a look at the 2016 dividend, the first year of the governor capped it. Under the historic formula, it would have been over $2,000. Well, last year, the legislature cut the dividend again by about half. It would have been $2,300. This year, it would have been $2,700, but the Senate, House, and governor have all agreed to a concept to trim it down to $1,600. Steve Reiger, a former lawmaker and a permanent fund trustee, told me in a conversation earlier this week that this way of doing business undermines the long-standing relationship that Alaskans have had with their fund.
There's a special link created between the permanent fund and the people as a result of the dividend, and it's not regarded as just another big pot of government money.
In the last 3 years, the permanent fund dividend has not been linked to the earnings of the fund. First time that that's happened. A lot of people are concerned about that. Should we be concerned?
Well, I'm very concerned. I think that the dividend has played one of the major roles in the success of the fund over these last few decades. So the fortunes of the dividend and the fortunes of the fund were tied together, and there was not only tremendous support, and has been, for the fund itself, but also for solid investment management of the fund.
The idea is that we put pressure on the investors to invest in what makes the most money for us rather than some pet project that comes up that might consume a lot of money.
Yes, I think that's a good way of putting it.
Is that really the concept?
That's the concept, and it's an important component. So there's a lot of things that have led to the permanent fund's success, but definitely that support for solid investment management has been an important part of it.
This has been a tremendous legacy. Do you feel like we're jeopardizing it at this point?
Yes. I mean, the permanent fund should be treated with a lot of care. I mean, $65 billion should take a tremendous amount of attention, and every step should be carefully considered.
Do you see that the permanent fund has a future?
If the dividend continues to be addressed in an ad hoc fashion year to year, I think the dividend is in jeopardy if that's the way that things continue. And in my view, as goes the dividend, so goes the permanent fund. Because as soon as it, if ever, it becomes just regarded as another big pot of government money, I think its days are numbered.
Steve Rieger says that the fund should switch to a % of market value program and manage more like a trust fund. Rieger says the new system should also be protected by a state constitutional amendment to protect the process of calculating dividends. Now, that could be a heavy lift because it takes 2/3 of each body of the legislature to put a constitutional amendment on the ballot. There is a Senate resolution to enshrine the dividend in the state constitution, but it's been stalled in committees. Senator Bill Wielechowski says he's worked for years to get this measure passed.
I've come to the conclusion that you can create another statutory rules-based system, a percent of market value system if the legislature chooses to do that. It's meaningless unless you put it in the Constitution, because a future legislature can simply ignore it, just like this legislature has ignored 35 years of practice in paying a full permanent fund dividend.
The resolution's next stop is the Senate Finance Committee. Coming up, legislative analysis from Larry Pursley in Juneau, a political veteran who has worked for 3 governors. And we're also joined by Tim Bradner, who is the visiting Atwood professor for journalism at the University of Alaska, Anchorage. Stay with us. We have had a 3-year departure from the old formula for doling out the dividend. The Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation's Board of Trustees recently weighed in on a need for a structure. In a resolution, they said adherence to a rules-based system for fund transfers is a basic element of best practices for management. It said a rules-based system improves the likelihood that the permanent fund will be sustainable over time. Well, joining us now to talk about that, 2 veteran permanent fund watchers, Larry Pursley coming to us from our sister station in Juneau, and here in our studios we have Tim Bradner, who has tracked the fund for years as a natural resources journalist. So the future of the fund, if the trustees have raised a red flag. Do you think that this is something we should pay attention to?
Well, I think so, Ron. What they're raising a red flag about is the lack of a structure for managing the fund earnings and the sort of ad hoc nature that we seem to be going about this. They want rules. They need to have those rules to plan their strategies for investment.
Larry, what do you think about that?
Yeah, building on that, what the permanent fund trustees have said by resolution for the past almost 2 decades, and as you say, just restated it, tell us how much you're going to take out every year so we can manage our investments. If the fund trustees are worried that the legislature may take out who knows how much next year, they're going to have to keep a larger percentage of investments in lower return bonds or other pieces. The state will lose earning potential because we won't know when you're going to have to draw the money. That costs us hundreds of millions of dollars a year in future earnings.
Well, last October, permanent fund managers pulled some money out of investments because they were uncertain about what the cash flow needs would be for the state. And lots of revenue was apparently lost then because the stock market was going gangbusters at that time.
True, of course, then the stock market drops, so it's always hard to time it. But if you're managing a $65 billion fund and you know it's going to be used to pay for public services each year, at which we're finally at that point, you want to know how much you're going to have to, how much the state is going to take out of the fund every year so I can manage it to have that money available, to have it liquid, not have it tied up in long-term investments. This is just the smart thing to do.
Well, I want to take a look at some numbers, that we really haven't heard all that much about, surprisingly, is the total amount that Alaskans would have received had the dividends not been capped. So not like if you include this year's dividend with the past 2 years, what wasn't paid out to Alaskans, that comes up to about $3,400. That's a lot of money there, a lot of money. And why aren't people squawking about that?
Ron, I think part of it is that people don't have a really good understanding as to how the dividend is calculated. A lot of this is just mumbo jumbo, and they don't pay that much attention to it. So frankly, they're just not aware of it. The other thing is I think a lot of people understand the physical constraints the state's in, and they realize that the dividend is sort of a gift, and part of it they're going to have to give up to help support public services. I think that spirit is out there.
Well, Larry, you've been working in Juneau as a legislative aide. What's the pulse of the people? Is that at all on the radar screen?
Sure, there are some legislators who wish we could have paid full dividends the last 2 years and this coming year, but they realize if you want to fund public safety, troopers, courts, prisons, road maintenance. If you want to fund education plus an increase in education, as most school districts, most education supporters are asking, you cannot afford to pay out $2,000 or $2,500 a year or more in dividends. It just doesn't add up. The money's not there.
Well, you always
And
wear
I think-
so many hats, Larry, and one of those was a deputy revenue commissioner for Frank Murkowski, and one of the things you were tasked with was to come up with a % of market value plan and float that. It didn't do very well, but in a nutshell, what is POMV?
Percent of market value plan is essentially just a cap. It's an annual limit on how much can be taken out of permanent fund earnings to help pay for public services, dividends, whatever the legislature wants to do. That's all it is. It just tells the fund managers this is the cap, the limit that we will withdraw each year, and tells the legislature this is how much money will go into the general fund for spending decisions. That's all it is. And we haven't needed it because we didn't need the permanent fund to help pay for schools and public services. Now we do. It's time to set that annual limit.
Well, do you think that this can accomplish Steve Rieger's goal of sort of keeping our connection to the earnings of the fund, that tie between the people and the profits?
Sure, because, well, I'll say yes and let Tim answer.
Tim?
No, I think indirectly it would. That's really, Steve makes a point that if you sever the relationship between the earnings of the fund and the growth of the dividend, people aren't going to be as sensitive to the performance of the fund. Now, I'm not sure really how many people actually follow the performance of the fund that closely, but it is important. It's an important connection, and it's historic since the beginning. That was the whole idea of the dividend, was to link
protect the fund in some ways.
Yeah.
Larry?
Right, and I don't think the legislature this year is going to set a formula for dividends, but in the future, I think they're moving toward looking at that annual withdrawal from fund earnings, and within that dollar amount, is it 70% for public services, 30% for dividends, 35%? I think eventually they'll settle on some split, so then the dividend will be based on how well the fund does.
Well, we've got some people really pushing for however we move forward with the dividend program, that it be part of our Constitution, that there be a constitutional amendment. Bill Wielechowski's resolution just hasn't gotten very far in the legislature. Why do you think?
I'll let Tim answer that one first.
Well, Rhonda, the House Finance Committee flirted with that idea too. As a matter of fact, they were very seriously behind the idea of an amendment in the Constitution. I think it would have been structured differently than what Senator Wielechowski wants, but they ran into some legal issues that were raised by the Legislative Affairs Agency. Basically, it gets complicated when you put spending and appropriation right directly into the Constitution. As a matter of fact, it gets legally complicated. And the legislative attorneys felt very strongly that it would be challenged and it would go to the Supreme Court and it might well fail.
Well, getting back to action for this session, what do you think will happen with the POMV? Is it very unlikely we'll see that this session?
Well, we will have a POMV in the budget. We have a one-year POMV. It's already there. It's 5.25%, which a lot of people feel is too high to really sustain the fund. For the long term, we need what the trustees are pushing for, which is an ongoing structure in the form of a statute, and maybe at some point have that structure be in the permanent fund. Whether the dividend is part of that is open to question, but that is probably the best way to do it in the long run.
Larry?
I still think there's a good chance. I think there's a good chance the legislature this year will establish a cap on annual withdrawals from the permanent fund and put it in statute to talk about putting the actual dividend in the Constitution. Tim's right. You can put in the Constitution the state shall fund education, but it doesn't give a dollar amount. You could put in there shall be a dividend, but once you start putting a specific dollar amount or formula, there are some serious legal issues. The other reason, I guess, that it hasn't moved forward is there are a lot of legislators who do not believe the dividend should be constitutionalized along with public safety, freedom of speech, and education.
So many controversies, it's hard to get to a solution here. But I want to go back to the middle school and college students that we heard from earlier in the show. What do you make of their reaction?
My sense is that they are, they and their parents have been reading the newspapers about the state's dire physical situation, and they're being realistic, I think. Although I think the point should be made that adopting a fiscal plan will preserve the dividend. And so, my answer to those students is help the legislature adopt a long-term fiscal plan, because that will assure that you will have a dividend for the future of some kind. Absent the dividend, absent that structure, I think we'll lose the dividend.
Larry, what's your take on what they had to say?
Well, I agree with Tim, and coming from me, I'm going to say the students were too cynical, and people who know me will find that hard to believe. But I agree with Tim. If there is a cap on annual withdrawals from the permanent fund, a full fiscal plan, I think the dividend will continue as long as Alaska exists or until the meteor hits the Earth. It may not be as much as people want, but there will be a dividend of some kind.
Well, overall, I mean, what do you see as the future of the fund? I mean, you see it continuing under certain circumstances, but even beyond just the dividend, what's the potential for it?
Well, the permanent fund will continue. I mean, the corpus of the fund, the principal can't be spent. So absent a constitutional amendment to undo the permanent fund, which is pretty far-fetched that people would approve that, I think it's secure itself. It's the earnings that we're talking about.
I agree with Tim. I think we'll continue to have oil income. We'll go into the fund, invest it well. It'll continue to build. If we can come up with a long-term fiscal plan that deals with new revenues and spending, I think the permanent fund, dividends, life should go on for a long time.
Well, $65 billion, about there is where it stands now. I don't think when it was started that people even imagined that it would be so big. What is the potential for what we could see someday? Could we see it be able to do a lot more than it does now?
Rhonda, Larry probably knows the answer to this. What is the value of Norway's permanent fund? $1 trillion?
It's close to $1 trillion, give or take $100 billion.
So the lesson for Alaska, the lesson for Alaska is that Norway started theirs 20 years after we did. They actually came to Alaska to study how we set up our permanent fund. They went home and they did it right. They did some things a lot differently than we do. Mainly, they put all of their oil revenue into the permanent fund, and they kept the taxes. They pay for their government with taxes, and they invest all of their resource revenue into their permanent fund.
So we can't do that. It's a little bit late.
Every penny. Right, it's a little late. Right, they pay no dividend. They kept their income tax at up to 50%. They kept the equivalent of a sales tax up to 25%. So everything went into their savings account, and people continue to pay taxes. That's not the way we played it in Alaska.
Well, Alaska is a very, very different kind of animal. Well, I want to thank both of you very much for joining us. Larry Pursley at our sister station at KTVA, and Tim Bradner, who also now teaches at UAA journalism. Thanks.
This year I'm privileged to be the Atwood visiting professor, so I'm teaching and I'm enjoying it thoroughly.
All right. Well, thanks very much. The future of the fund. We hope we've given you a better idea of what's at stake. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next week.